surprise.
Yeah, Big Mama, I just want.
Sharon, that's you? Oh, what a beautiful.
Oh, no, what the hell are you doing? Put that thing down.
No, Big Mama, we have to go now, and I just wanted to say thank you.
There is something strangely revealing about Big Momma's house too. On paper, almost everything about it sounds like the kind of sequel critics are trained to distrust. It takes a character who had already been built around an enormous disguise, places that disguise into another familiar undercover situation, surrounds it with broad physical comedy, and asks audiences to watch Martin Lawrence once again become Big Momma. By the standards of originality, that sounds like a warning sign rather than a promise. And yet, somehow, the movie worked. Not universally, not critically, and certainly not according to the people who were measuring it against more sophisticated standards of comedy. But commercially, it worked very well. Made for a reported $40 million, Big Momma's House 2 ultimately earned roughly $141.5 million worldwide, turning a movie that looked like an easy target for critics into a profitable theatrical success. That contradiction is the real reason the film is worth revisiting. How does a movie critics practically buried become a box office hit? And more importantly, what does that gap between critical opinion and audience reaction actually tell us about the movie? The critical response was extremely negative, with Rotten Tomatoes eventually recording an approval score of only 5%, while Metacritic placed the film at 34 out of 100. Those numbers suggest a comedy that had failed almost completely on the level of conventional critical judgment. But audiences saw something different. CinemaScore gave it an A-, a remarkably strong response for a sequel that critics considered unnecessary and repetitive. That difference cannot simply be dismissed as audiences having lower standards. It points toward a different definition of success. Big Momma's House 2 was not trying to reinvent comedy. It was trying to deliver a recognizable experience with a recognizable star, and it understood that the very absurdity critics disliked could be exactly what its target audience had come to see. Martin Lawrence's transformation is the center of that strategy. The moment his ordinary FBI identity disappears beneath the makeup, costume, prosthetics, voice, posture, and exaggerated personality of Big Momma, the movie becomes a strange collision of genres. There is espionage happening somewhere underneath the story, but on top of that espionage is a nanny comedy about children, household chaos, discipline, family problems, and domestic embarrassment. The contrast is almost ridiculous. An FBI agent dealing with a national security investigation should be concerned with surveillance and criminal evidence. Instead, he is worrying about children, cleaning, cooking, behavioral problems, and how long he can maintain the illusion that this larger-than-life grandmother is a believable caretaker. That bizarre combination is precisely what makes the movie difficult to categorize. Is it an action comedy? A family comedy? A disguised comedy? A domestic sitcom stretched onto a theatrical screen? Or is it something even more interesting, a movie that looks less intelligent than it actually is because its ideas are buried underneath broad jokes? The answer is complicated, because Big Momma's House 2 is not secretly a masterpiece hiding beneath a fat suit. Many of its weaknesses are real. The plotting is predictable, the villain is not especially memorable, the comedy is uneven, and the disguise formula had already been established by the original film. But beneath those limitations is a surprisingly coherent emotional idea. Malcolm Turner is a man whose professional life depends on control. He observes people, deceives them, improvises under pressure, and changes his identity whenever a mission requires it. Yet the role that ultimately challenges him most is not another criminal persona. It is Big Momma. Inside the Fuller household, the FBI's skills that normally make Malcolm effective are only partially useful. He can gather evidence, but he cannot investigate a child's insecurity. He can maintain surveillance, but he cannot simply observe a family and remain emotionally untouched by it. He can create a disguise, but he cannot fake every moment of genuine connection. That is where the movie becomes more interesting than its reputation suggests. Big Mama is supposed to be a disguise, but the disguise gradually becomes a strange form of emotional permission. Malcolm can behave differently because everyone believes he is someone else. He can be patient, nurturing, embarrassing, loud, affectionate, domestic, and openly involved in problems that would normally sit outside his carefully controlled professional identity. The comedy comes from watching a highly trained federal agent trapped in situations that cannot be solved through federal agent logic. But the emotional story comes from something deeper, the possibility that the role Malcolm thinks is least authentic to him might actually expose parts of his personality he has spent years keeping hidden. And that brings us to the Fuller family. At first, they are simply obstacles to the mission. Leah is exhausted. Molly is rebellious. Carrie is struggling with her own insecurities. Andrew is younger and more innocent. Tom is connected to the investigation. From Malcolm's perspective, these people are variables that complicate the operation. But the more time he spends around them, the harder it becomes to treat them like pieces on an FBI board. The movie's real curiosity lies there. What happens when an undercover agent becomes emotionally invested in the people he was originally assigned to watch? And what happens when the performance he created for a mission begins changing the person behind it? Those questions are much more substantial than the jokes surrounding them. That is why Big Mama's House 2 deserves to be examined beyond the easy verdict of bad sequel. It may not be great cinema, but it is a fascinating example of what audiences sometimes want from a movie, not innovation at any cost, but familiarity, personality, warmth, physical comedy, and the reassuring pleasure of watching a performer inhabit a character everyone already understands. To understand why that formula connected with audiences, it helps to look at the film as more than an isolated comedy. Big Mama's House 2 arrived out of a very specific period in Hollywood, when recognizable stars could carry entire movies and when sequels were often designed around the most immediately marketable element of the original. In this case, that element was obvious. It was Big Mama herself. The first movie had already established Martin Lawrence as Malcolm Turner, an FBI agent capable of transforming himself into the outrageous elderly woman known as Big Mama. The sequel did not need to explain the central gimmick from scratch. Audiences already knew what the character looked like, how she sounded, and why the sight of Martin Lawrence operating underneath an exaggerated disguise could produce comedy. That familiarity became the foundation of the sequel. But rather than simply repeating the exact structure of the first film, the story shifts the environment. Malcolm is again using Big Mama to enter a household, but this time the family dynamic becomes much more important. The Fuller home is not merely a place to hide. It becomes the movie's primary comedic arena and eventually its emotional center. John Whitesell directs the film with a practical understanding of what kind of comedy he has inherited. The movie does not chase visual experimentation or attempt to reinvent the language of the franchise. Instead, it moves efficiently between undercover action, domestic comedy, family conflict, physical gags, and moments of sentiment. Don Reimer and Daryl Quarles contribute to the screenplay, while George S. Clinton provides the musical score. helping the film move between its different tonal identities. The production exists within the larger Fox and Regency New Regency studio ecosystem of the period, where recognizable properties and established performers could be positioned as reliable theatrical entertainment. The reported $40 million budget reflects that middle-range studio strategy. This was not an enormous effects-driven blockbuster, but it was substantial enough to support a major star, elaborate makeup and costume work, action sequences, sets, production design, and a national theatrical campaign. The challenge was not simply financial. It was creative. How do you repeat a joke without making the audience feel as though they are watching the same movie again? The answer Big Momma's House 2 chooses is to make the disguise itself familiar while changing what the disguise has to accomplish. The first film established the novelty of Malcolm becoming Big Momma. The sequel explores what happens when Big Momma has to function inside a family. That decision pushes the movie toward a nanny premise, and that shift explains much of its personality. Suddenly, the disguise is not only about deception. It is about domestic responsibility. Big Momma has to occupy space in a home, interact with children, earn trust, and solve problems that cannot be handled through the usual undercover tricks. The movie is only around 99 minutes long, so it does not have the luxury of developing every character with great depth. Its structure is deliberately compact. The plot needs to establish the threat, introduce the family, get Malcolm into the house, generate escalating complications, and eventually bring the criminal and emotional stories together. That compressed structure contributes to the film's broad, almost television-like rhythm. It moves quickly because the audience already understands the central concept. There is no need for prolonged explanation. The premise can be communicated in a trailer almost instantly. Martin Lawrence becomes Big Momma again, this time to infiltrate a family as a nanny. In a Hollywood marketplace filled with competing comedies, that kind of clarity mattered. The January 2006 release also tells us something about the movie's commercial positioning. 21st Century Fox, through its theatrical distribution operation at the time, was not selling an unknown property. It was selling a recognizable character and a familiar comedian. Martin Lawrence already had a strong public identity, and Big Momma was visually unmistakable. A poster could communicate the joke. A trailer could communicate the joke. A television advertisement could communicate the joke. The marketing did not need to convince audiences that they were buying into a complicated new universe. It only needed to remind them why they had laughed the first time. This is one of the most important differences between critical expectations and commercial expectations. A critic may ask whether a sequel expands the artistic possibilities of its predecessor. A studio executive may ask whether the audience understands the premise in 10 seconds. Big Momma's House 2 was built for the second question. The movie's family versus undercover setup was especially useful because it created several layers of accessible comedy at once. There was the obvious physical humor of Martin Lawrence inside the costume. There was the situational humor of an FBI agent pretending to be a nanny. There was the chaos of children. There was the tension of maintaining a secret identity. And there was the possibility of action whenever the criminal investigation resurfaced. That mixture made the film easy to advertise because every element could be reduced to a familiar phrase: undercover agent, giant disguise, impossible children. It also arrived at a time when audiences were comfortable with star-driven comedies that did not necessarily promise critical sophistication. The early 2000s had produced a wide range of broad theatrical comedies built around recognizable performers and simple premises. Some became cultural touchstones. Others disappeared quickly. The common denominator was accessibility. If audiences knew the star and understood the joke, the movie had a chance. Big Momma's House 2 had both. Its opening weekend of approximately $27.7 million demonstrated that the strategy worked. It was not merely a modest opening from a familiar property. It immediately established itself as a significant theatrical performer. The movie's commercial story therefore begins before audiences even saw the film. It begins with the decision to make familiarity the product. Big Momma was not simply a character. She was the brand. Martin Lawrence was not simply the actor. He was the reason the disguise could sell the entire premise. And the sequel did not need to convince audiences that the concept was new. It needed to convince them that the concept was still fun. That becomes especially important when the story itself begins, because Malcolm Turner is introduced as someone who has made a career out of becoming other people. He is an FBI agent whose professional advantage is not brute force or technological genius alone. It is his ability to perform. He can read a situation, build a persona, and disappear into it. In the opening stages of the film, that skill establishes him as competent, but it also quietly establishes the emotional problem that will define the story. Malcolm is extremely comfortable being someone else. What he is less comfortable doing is simply being himself around other people. His professional identity gives him a kind of armor. He knows what to do when there is a target, a mission, and a role to play. Then the death of his mentor gives the case a personal and professional urgency. The investigation expands into a matter involving computer specialist Tom Fuller and information with national security implications. Malcolm is assigned to the case, and suddenly the familiar Big Momma identity becomes useful again. The disguise is not chosen because Malcolm wants to revisit an old joke. He chooses it because the mission requires access to the Fuller household, and Big Momma provides the most convincing route inside. The transformation is therefore both comic spectacle and narrative machinery. The movie understands that audiences came to see the transformation, so it gives the process a physical presence. Makeup, costume, prosthetics, body shape, voice, posture, and movement all contribute to the illusion. But once the transformation is complete, the real joke begins. Malcolm may have mastered the disguise, but he has not mastered the environment into which the disguise carries him. The Fuller household is immediately more complicated than a surveillance operation. Leah Fuller is exhausted by the responsibilities of family life. The children are not interchangeable obstacles. Molly is rebellious and difficult to control. Carrie has her own social and emotional concerns. Andrew brings a different kind of energy, one rooted in innocence and unpredictability. The household feels lived in, messy, noisy, and emotionally crowded. For Malcolm, this is a radically different form of danger. Criminals can be anticipated. Children cannot. A suspect can be followed. A child can suddenly demand attention for a reason that has nothing to do with the case. An FBI agent can control a briefing. A nanny has to react to whatever happens in front of her. That distinction becomes the engine of the comedy. When Big Momma first enters the Fuller environment, Malcolm is essentially trying to perform two jobs at once. He needs to maintain the illusion that he is an elderly nanny while also gathering information about Tom Fuller. The first interactions with the children make it clear that the domestic role will not be passive. Big Mama has to establish authority quickly. Molly, in particular, is resistant to being controlled by an unfamiliar caretaker. Carrie and Andrew create their own complications, and Leah's exhaustion makes it obvious that the household needs more than another adult standing around watching. Malcolm's discomfort is therefore immediate and useful. The audience knows that the person beneath the costume is an FBI agent. The children do not. Every ordinary domestic situation becomes a potential exposure risk. If Malcolm reacts too efficiently, he may seem suspicious. If he reacts too much like a grandmother, he may lose control of the situation. And if he forgets the disguise altogether, the mission collapses. Kevin Keneally's involvement adds another layer to Malcolm's professional world, creating a contrast between the controlled logic of the investigation and the unpredictable environment of the Fuller home. Surveillance becomes more difficult because Malcolm cannot simply sit back and watch. He has responsibilities. He must move around the house, answer questions, deal with the children, and respond to problems that appear at the worst possible times. That is where the movie begins turning the original disguise premise into something structurally different. Big Mama is no longer merely hiding Malcolm. She is demanding that Malcolm participate. The disguise puts him in a position where observation is no longer enough. He has to act like a member of the household. And the more convincingly he does that, the more emotionally complicated the mission becomes. The second act grows from that contradiction. At first, Malcolm treats nanny responsibilities as interruptions. Cleaning, discipline, household routines, children's arguments, and emotional problems all stand between him and the investigation. But comedy has a way of changing the meaning of interruptions. The things that slow Malcolm down also force him to learn the people he is watching. Molly's rebellion stops being a simple nuisance when Malcolm begins to understand that her behavior is connected to the emotional atmosphere of the household. Carrie's insecurities create a different kind of problem, one that cannot be solved by intimidation. Andrew's innocence offers yet another challenge because he responds to Big Mama with a directness that bypasses Malcolm's professional defenses. Leah's exhaustion becomes increasingly visible. She is not simply a mother who needs help for the sake of the plot. She represents the invisible pressure of keeping a family functioning while carrying responsibilities that other people often take for granted. Malcolm enters the house thinking he is the person who will be observing the family, but gradually the family begins observing him. They test him. They depend on him. They expose him to situations in which his usual emotional distance becomes difficult to maintain. At the same time, Tom's technological activities keep the investigation alive. Malcolm gathers evidence, watches behavior, and communicates with the FBI. The criminal plot does not disappear. Instead, it becomes woven into domestic routines. That structure allows the film to alternate between surveillance tension and household comedy without completely abandoning either side. A serious investigative beat can be followed by a physical gag. A family argument can suddenly become relevant to Malcolm's cover. A domestic responsibility can interfere with professional surveillance. The genres collide because Malcolm himself is caught between them. His relationship with Kevin reinforces that tension. Kevin represents the professional side of Malcolm's life, the world where missions have objectives and identities are tools. Inside the Fuller home, however, Malcolm increasingly discovers that the Big Mama identity has consequences beyond the mission. The children respond to Big Mama as a person, not as an FBI strategy. This is why the physical comedy matters more than it might appear. The exaggerated body, the costume, the voice, the movement, and the reactions are not only there to make audiences laugh. They repeatedly place Malcolm in situations where dignity is impossible. An agent trained to maintain control is forced into embarrassment. He has to deal with messes, misunderstandings, arguments, and physical discomfort. He cannot preserve the polished image of a professional man because the Big Mama persona is intentionally undignified. Yet that humiliation gradually becomes liberating. Malcolm can no longer pretend that competence means always being in control. Sometimes competence means knowing how to respond when control disappears. The movie turns that lesson into comedy. The midpoint of the story deepens the conflict because the evidence surrounding Tom creates genuine danger, while Malcolm's emotional involvement with the family becomes harder to deny. He began the assignment believing that the Fuller household was something to enter, inspect, and leave. But after spending enough time there, he has become part of its daily rhythm. Family bonding moments begin to matter. Big Mama's authority is no longer purely performative. The children have started to respond to her. Leah begins to rely on her. Malcolm's professional objective therefore becomes complicated by a new question. If the family is in danger, is he protecting them because the mission requires it or because he actually cares about them? That distinction matters because it marks the point where the disguise stops being emotionally neutral. A disguise normally creates distance between the performer and the person being deceived. Here, it creates intimacy. The more successfully Malcolm performs Big Mama, the closer he gets to the family. The possibility of exposure becomes more frightening because exposure would no longer mean simply losing a case. It would mean betraying people who have come to trust someone who technically does not exist. The film does not always explore that idea with subtlety, but it is there beneath the jokes. Malcolm's false identity has produced real relationships. The irony is almost unavoidable. He lies to the family in order to protect a professional investigation, yet the emotional truth that develops inside the lie is genuine. That tension carries into the final act, where the criminal investigation and the family storyline finally converge. The threat becomes immediate, the FBI response becomes more direct, and Malcolm is forced to protect the Fullers rather than merely investigate them. Big Mama's physical presence becomes especially useful in the climax because the disguise allows the movie to combine danger with absurdity. The action is not presented with the seriousness of a conventional thriller. It remains filtered through the film's comic identity. Physical movement, exaggerated reactions, and the possibility of the disguise failing all become part of the suspense. Yet beneath the slapstick is a straightforward emotional payoff. Malcolm has chosen the family. He is no longer simply completing an assignment. The people who once represented obstacles to his mission have become the reason the mission matters. The family members themselves also contribute to the resolution, reinforcing the idea that Malcolm's relationship with them has changed. He is protecting people who have, in their own ways, become part of his life. When the criminal threat is resolved, the consequences of the Big Mama identity become more interesting than the criminal plot itself. Malcolm has to return to his professional identity, but the audience has already seen that his professional identity is incomplete. Big Mama was supposed to be a costume. Instead, the role exposed qualities Malcolm did not normally display. Patience, empathy, domestic responsibility, emotional openness, and a willingness to be ridiculous all became part of his transformation. The question is whether the ending earns that emotional payoff. For some viewers, the sentiment may feel predictable because the movie has been signaling the lesson for most of its runtime. For others, the simplicity is exactly why it works. The film does not need Malcolm to become a completely different person. It only needs him to recognize that the person underneath the disguise has changed. That brings us directly to Malcolm himself, because the easiest way to misunderstand Big Momma's House 2 is to reduce Malcolm Turner to a man wearing a fat suit. The costume is visually enormous, but Malcolm's real conflict is much smaller and much more human. He is a man who believes control is safety. His job rewards that belief. He survives by planning, improvising, reading people, and keeping emotional distance. The FBI environment gives him a clear identity. There is a mission. There is a target. There is a hierarchy. There are rules. Inside the Fuller home, those rules stop working. A child does not care about Malcolm's professional credentials. Leah does not need another investigator. She needs help. Molly does not respond to authority simply because it is authority. Carrie needs understanding. Andrew responds to honesty. Malcolm's training cannot solve those problems in the same way it solves a surveillance operation. Big Momma therefore becomes an exaggerated version of freedom. As Big Momma, Malcolm can be louder, more theatrical, more emotionally expressive, and less concerned with maintaining conventional masculine dignity. He can embarrass himself because embarrassment is built into the persona. The costume creates distance from Malcolm's normal identity, but paradoxically that distance allows him to become more emotionally present. This is one of the most interesting ideas in the film. Disguise is usually associated with deception. Here, disguise also becomes a route toward honesty. Malcolm cannot easily admit that he wants connection as Malcolm, but Big Momma can provide it without threatening his carefully maintained image. He can teach the children because the character permits him to be nurturing. He can show patience because nobody expects an FBI agent to behave like a grandmother. He can participate in domestic labor because the costume has already removed him from the masculine expectations attached to his professional role. The transformation is therefore psychological as much as physical. His relationship with the children is where that transformation becomes most visible. At first, Malcolm wants them controlled because they interfere with his mission. Eventually, he begins wanting them to be okay. That is a small difference in language but a major difference in character. Control is about reducing unpredictability. Care is about accepting unpredictability and responding to it. Malcolm gradually moves from one to the other. Molly's rebelliousness forces him to develop patience. Carrie's insecurities require empathy rather than intimidation. Andrew's innocence gives him opportunities to experience affection without calculation. Leah becomes important because she represents the adult consequences of family dysfunction. Malcolm sees how exhausted she is and begins to understand that family problems are not solved by one dramatic intervention. They are managed through constant emotional work. The movie's comedy frequently turns that work into spectacle, but its underlying observation is surprisingly familiar. Families are exhausting. Parenting is repetitive. Emotional labor is often invisible. People who appear difficult may be responding to problems nobody else can see. Malcolm begins as an outsider who believes he is there to solve a case. He gradually becomes a participant who understands that the family cannot be reduced to the problem he was sent to investigate. His transformation is not heroic in the traditional sense. He does not become more powerful. He becomes more available. The antagonist, meanwhile, is less psychologically developed, and that is one of the film's genuine weaknesses. Tom Fuller initially appears to be the center of the criminal mystery because the investigation revolves around his technological activities and the national security implications attached to them. But structurally, the criminal threat is less important as a character than as a mechanism. It is what forces Malcolm into the Fuller household. It creates the external pressure that allows the internal transformation to happen. The villain does not need to be especially complex because the movie's primary conflict is not really between Malcolm and a criminal mastermind. It is between Malcolm's professional identity and the emotional world he has entered. That does not excuse the thinness of the antagonist. A stronger villain could have created more tension and made the investigative side of the story more compelling. But the movie repeatedly prioritizes character comedy over villain psychology, and that choice explains why audiences are more likely to remember Big Mama than the details of the criminal threat. The external antagonist threatens the family's safety. The internal antagonist is Malcolm's own emotional distance. The first can be defeated through investigation and action. The second requires something much harder: vulnerability. The Fuller family provides the emotional ecosystem that makes that vulnerability possible. Leah is particularly important because she grounds the movie's domestic comedy in a recognizable adult problem: exhaustion. She is surrounded by children with different needs and a household that requires constant management. Big Mama's arrival creates relief because Malcolm, even while pretending to be someone else, begins taking some of that burden away. Tom's position within the family and his connection to the investigation create another layer of uncertainty. Molly represents rebellion and resistance. She is not simply a source of jokes. She tests Big Mama's authority and forces Malcolm to understand that control cannot be demanded. Carrie represents another side of childhood, where social insecurity and identity concerns create problems that are less obvious than physical misbehavior. Andrew provides innocence and unpredictability, reminding Malcolm that not every family interaction has to be strategic. Kevin, by contrast, belongs to Malcolm's professional world. His presence creates a useful contrast because it reminds the audience that the FBI identity still exists outside the house. Together, these characters turn the Fuller home into a pressure chamber for Malcolm's personality. Every member of the family pulls something different out of him. The ensemble may not be written with the complexity of a prestige family drama, but it does something essential for a broad comedy. It gives the central performer people to bounce against. Martin Lawrence's performance becomes the gravitational center, but the supporting characters determine what kind of Big Mama he has to become. At the thematic level, the film is surprisingly consistent. Its most obvious subject is family, but beneath the family comedy is a conflict between career and emotional presence. Malcolm is successful at his job because he can disappear into identities. That same ability can make genuine intimacy difficult. He is always performing, always adapting, always reading the room. The Fuller household demands something different. It demands presence. A child cannot be handled through a cover story. A tired parent cannot be helped through surveillance. A family argument does not disappear because an agent has completed his objective. The movie therefore uses comedy to explore responsibility. Parenting is presented through exaggeration, but the underlying problems are ordinary. Children need attention, adults become exhausted, communication breaks down, and families often struggle because everyone is reacting to the immediate problem instead of understanding the larger emotional situation. Big Mama's role allows Malcolm to enter that world without his normal defenses. The disguise becomes a metaphor for identity itself. We all perform different versions of ourselves depending on where we are. The difference is that Malcolm's performance is literal. He puts on another body, another voice, another set of expectations. Yet the irony is that the artificial identity allows him to express genuine qualities. That makes the film's treatment of masculinity particularly interesting. Malcolm's professional image is associated with competence, control, physical capability, and emotional restraint. Big Mama is associated with domestic authority, caregiving, emotional expressiveness, and social embarrassment. The film repeatedly gets laughs from placing Malcolm inside a role traditionally coded as feminine. But underneath the jokes is an accidental question about why those qualities should be considered incompatible with masculinity in the first place. Malcolm does not become weaker by learning to care for the family. He becomes more capable. The visual language supports that idea. Big Mama's costume is deliberately excessive. It changes Martin Lawrence's silhouette, movement, facial appearance, and physical relationship to the environment. In a conventional disguise story, the goal is invisibility. Here, the disguise achieves almost the opposite. Big Mama is impossible to ignore. She occupies space loudly. Her body becomes part of the comedy. Her clothing communicates personality before she speaks. Her physical movement changes the rhythm of scenes. Mirrors and transformation imagery are naturally important because the audience is constantly aware that there is another person underneath the surface. The Fuller home itself also functions differently from the FBI environments. Professional spaces are associated with surveillance, information, control, and mission objectives. Domestic spaces are associated with clutter, repetition, noise, food, children, and emotional interaction. The kitchen is especially important as a symbolic domestic space because it places Malcolm in an environment where labor is visible. Cooking and cleaning are not glamorous activities, but they keep the household functioning. By forcing Malcolm into those spaces, the film strips away the glamour of the undercover agent identity. He has to deal with the ordinary. His movement becomes physical comedy because the costume makes simple tasks more difficult. His body no longer behaves like the body of a trained agent. That physical limitation becomes a visual representation of his emotional limitation. He cannot simply move through the family world as efficiently as he moves through a professional one. The deeper meaning of the disguise is therefore less about deception than liberation. Malcolm can only access certain emotional qualities once he stops performing the traditional image of himself. Big Mama gives him permission to be vulnerable because nobody sees the vulnerable behavior as belonging to Malcolm. The role is supposedly fake, but the emotions produced by it are real. This creates a fascinating contradiction around gender performance. The movie uses broad humor to make the transformation into an elderly woman visually ridiculous, but it also demonstrates that identity is more flexible than Malcolm believes. The person underneath the costume does not disappear. Instead, he gains access to behaviors he had previously restricted. Domestic labor becomes a form of character development. Parenting becomes a form of emotional education. Family communication becomes more important than professional control. The movie probably did not set out to construct a sophisticated theory of masculinity, and it would be a mistake to pretend that every implication was consciously designed. But films can communicate ideas beyond their creators' explicit intentions. Sometimes a broad comedy accidentally creates a useful contradiction. It asks the audience to laugh at a man pretending to be a woman while simultaneously showing that the qualities associated with that disguise make him a better version of himself. The comedy creates a safe distance from the seriousness of the idea. Viewers can laugh first and recognize the emotional truth later, even if they never consciously articulate it. Because the film is live action, the production's visual effects story is really a story about practical transformation. The Big Mama appearance depends heavily on makeup, prosthetic work, costume construction, performance, camera framing, and Martin Lawrence's physical control. The audience is not simply watching an actor wearing a costume. They are watching an actor learn how to move as a character whose physical proportions have been deliberately altered. Every gesture becomes different. Sitting down becomes a joke. Turning becomes a joke. Running becomes a joke. Entering a room becomes a joke because the body itself has become part of the performance. That is why practical transformation remains so memorable in the franchise. Digital effects can create astonishing images, but physical comedy often benefits from physical reality. Martin Lawrence actually has to interact with the environment while carrying the visual burden of Big Mama. The costume changes the way he occupies the frame, and the camera can then capture genuine movement and genuine reactions. Editing becomes crucial because physical comedy depends on timing. A setup must last long enough for the audience to understand the situation, but the reaction must arrive quickly enough to produce surprise. Reaction shots become especially important because they allow the movie to show not only what Big Mama does but how other characters respond to the absurdity. The contrast between a completely serious reaction and an obviously ridiculous physical situation is a classic comedy mechanism. John Whitesell's direction is built around that accessibility. He is constantly balancing several genres without allowing any one of them to dominate completely. The crime material provides stakes. The family story provides emotional context. The disguise provides the visual joke. The children provide unpredictable situations. Martin Lawrence provides the central comedic energy. The direction rarely calls attention to itself because the film's priority is momentum. Scenes need to move quickly enough to prevent the domestic material from becoming repetitive, while the investigative plot must return often enough to remind audiences that the story has an external objective. That conventional approach has strengths. The movie is easy to follow. Its transitions are clear. Its visual language is functional. Its comedic beats are designed to be understood immediately. But the same restraint can make the filmmaking feel predictable. There is little sense that the director is trying to challenge the audience visually. Instead, the movie feels distinctly like a 2000s studio comedy, where the camera exists primarily to support the performers and the jokes. That is not necessarily a flaw. Sometimes conventional filmmaking is exactly what a broad comedy requires. The problem only appears when the underlying material is not strong enough to justify the predictability. Big Momma's House 2 survives that problem largely because Martin Lawrence is such a strong physical performer. Music plays a quieter but essential role in holding the movie's different identities together. George S. Clinton's score has to communicate danger, comedy, absurdity, and emotional warmth without making the film feel tonally fractured. Action-oriented scoring can quickly establish that Malcolm's FBI mission is still serious even when the audience knows the movie will soon return to jokes. Comedy cues can then exaggerate the ridiculousness of a situation, especially when Big Momma's physical presence turns an ordinary moment into a spectacle. The score effectively tells the audience how to interpret a scene. A musical cue can make an action beat feel more dangerous, a domestic moment feel warmer, or a physical gag feel even more ridiculous. That relationship between music and comedy is easy to overlook because audiences often notice the joke but not the timing underneath it. Yet comedy depends heavily on rhythm, and music becomes part of that rhythm. When a cue builds tension before a punchline, the audience is being guided emotionally toward the moment. When the music suddenly changes, it can signal that the genre has shifted from crime story to family comedy. That flexibility is necessary because Big Momma's House 2 constantly moves between worlds. Songs and sound design perform a similar function. The early 2000s soundtrack environment was deeply connected to pop and R&B culture, and recognizable songs could help a comedy feel contemporary rather than simply functional. Dialogue is also treated rhythmically. Martin Lawrence's performance depends on voice, pauses, reactions, volume, and timing. The sound design amplifies physical comedy through exaggerated movement noises, domestic chaos, sudden impacts, and moments of silence. Silence can be especially powerful before a punchline because the absence of sound creates anticipation. Then the joke arrives with a visual or vocal impact. Domestic spaces also have their own soundscape. Children talking, objects moving, household activity, and overlapping voices create the impression that the Fuller home is always in motion. That matters because the family environment is supposed to feel chaotic compared with Malcolm's controlled professional world. Sound helps communicate that difference even before the characters explain it. When the film finally reached audiences in January 2006, the contradiction at its center became impossible to ignore. Critics were largely unimpressed. Rotten Tomatoes recorded only 5% approval, while Metacritic gave the movie a 34 out of 100. Those numbers reflect a familiar set of complaints. The sequel repeats the disguise formula, the jokes are broad, the plot is predictable, and the movie does not appear to justify its own existence beyond giving audiences another round of Martin Lawrence as Big Momma. But audiences did not respond in the same way. The film opened to approximately $27.7 million domestically and reached the #1 position at the box office. CinemaScore's A- response is especially revealing because CinemaScore measures audience reaction in a way that captures something critics often do not: whether viewers felt they received the experience they expected when they bought the ticket. And Big Momma's House 2 delivered exactly what its marketing promised. It had Martin Lawrence. It had Big Momma. It had disguised comedy. It had family chaos. It had physical humor. It had a simple story that did not require viewers to work hard to understand the premise. From a critical perspective, that simplicity was a weakness. From an audience perspective, it could be a strength. People did not necessarily need the sequel to be more sophisticated. They needed it to be familiar and entertaining. The gap between the two reactions therefore says something important about how comedy is evaluated. A film can be technically repetitive and still provide a satisfying experience. A joke can be predictable and still make someone laugh. A movie can be critically disposable and personally memorable. Its long-term legacy follows that same pattern. Big Momma's House 2 did not transform cinema. It did not introduce a new visual language. It did not become a landmark in screenwriting. But it became part of the recognizable ecosystem of 2000s comedy. For viewers who encountered it through DVDs, cable reruns, television broadcasts, family movie nights, or later streaming availability, the film could become detached from the critical conversation that surrounded its release. A child who watched it repeatedly did not care that a critic had given it a poor score. They remembered Martin Lawrence's voice, Big Momma's appearance, the family chaos, and the physical jokes. Years later, those memories can become stronger than the original viewing experience. That is the strange power of nostalgia. It does not necessarily tell us that a movie was objectively better than we thought. It tells us that the movie became attached to a period of our lives. The franchise continued with Big Mommas, like father, like son in 2011, demonstrating that the character still had enough commercial recognition to support another theatrical entry. But the more interesting legacy may be smaller. It lives in the memory of people who remember watching the movie without remembering why critics disliked it. That is why the film can feel almost different when revisited years later. And that brings us to the central disagreement. Was Big Momma's House 2 actually a good movie? The critical case against it is easy to understand. The premise is recycled. The villain is thin. The plot is predictable. The comedy leans heavily on Martin Lawrence's physical performance. The fat suit humor and gender-based jokes belong unmistakably to an early 2000s comedy culture, and some of them can feel dated when viewed through a modern lens. The movie often chooses the broadest possible joke instead of the most inventive one. But the audience defense is also understandable. The film is warm. It is accessible. Martin Lawrence is charismatic. The Fuller family provides enough personality to keep the domestic story moving. Big Momma remains a memorable screen persona. The movie does not demand much from the viewer, but it gives the viewer a clear emotional experience. That distinction between a good movie and a good time is important. They are not always the same thing. A technically accomplished film can be emotionally cold. A poorly reviewed comedy can become a comfort movie. Neither fact invalidates the other. Financially, the film's success makes the Hollywood logic even clearer. Against the reported $40 million production budget, Box Office Mojo lists approximately $70.2 million in domestic gross and about $71.4 million internationally, for a worldwide total of roughly $141.5 million. The numbers validate the studio's decision in a way reviews could not. The sequel was profitable because the audience recognized the property. The marketing hook was simple. The star was familiar. The character was familiar. The premise was easy to communicate. There was no need to teach audiences how to understand Big Momma. They already knew. That is the foundation of sequel economics. Familiarity reduces risk. A studio may not know whether audiences will love a new character, but it has a much better idea whether audiences recognize an established one. Big Momma's House 2 demonstrates the power of that recognition. Martin Lawrence's bankability and the franchise's identity turned a relatively modestly budgeted comedy into a substantial theatrical performer. The third film, Big Mommas, Like Father, Like Son, eventually arrived in 2011, confirming that the studio still saw commercial value in the property. The broader lesson is not that reviews do not matter. It is that Hollywood measures value through several different systems at once. Critics measure artistic quality. Audiences measure enjoyment. Studios measure revenue. Sometimes those measurements align. Sometimes they do not. Big Momma's House 2 is interesting because they diverged so dramatically. Historically, that makes the film more useful than its reputation might suggest. It represents an era of Hollywood comedy built around recognizable stars, broad physical humor, sequels, and easily marketable premises. Martin Lawrence's film career was already connected to the star-driven comedy tradition, and Big Momma became one of his most recognizable screen personas. The character also belongs to a longer tradition of disguise-based and cross-dressing comedy, where the humor comes from placing a performer into a role that creates a collision between appearance and identity. What makes Big Momma distinct is the sheer physicality of the transformation. The character is not a subtle disguise. She is a visual event. That made the franchise particularly compatible with theatrical marketing, television advertising, and later DVD culture. You could recognize Big Momma instantly. In an era when home video exposure could extend a movie's life far beyond its theatrical run, that recognizability mattered. A film could become part of family viewing even if it had not been embraced by critics. Big Momma's House 2 belongs to that category of movies whose cultural significance is partly measured by how often people encountered them rather than how highly reviewers ranked them. Still, time has changed the way some of its comedy lands. Martin Lawrence's charisma remains one of the film's strongest assets. His physical commitment to Big Momma is undeniable, and the character remains visually memorable. The family themes are also accessible because the problems they represent are not limited to 2006. Children still test boundaries. Parents still become exhausted. Families still struggle with communication. People still hide emotional vulnerability behind professional identities. Those elements age better than individual jokes. The practical nature of the transformation also gives the movie a physical quality that modern audiences can find refreshing. But some aspects of the comedy feel unmistakably tied to its era. Fat suit humor, exaggerated gender jokes, and certain stereotypes may not carry the same automatic comedic force today. Modern viewers are more likely to question what older comedies treated as harmless shorthand. That does not mean the film must be condemned from the present. It means the context should be acknowledged. A movie can be both nostalgic and dated. In fact, that combination is one of the defining experiences of rewatching older comedy. That is where the distinction between nostalgia and objective quality becomes essential. Nostalgia can soften weaknesses, but it can also reveal strengths that a first viewing overlooked. Someone who watched Big Momma's House 2 as a child may remember it as a hilarious family adventure. An adult rewatch may expose the predictable plot and repetitive jokes. But the adult may also notice the emotional structure beneath the comedy. Malcolm's transformation suddenly looks less like a simple costume gag and more like a story about a man who has spent too much time hiding behind professional competence. Leah's exhaustion becomes more recognizable. The children feel less like comic obstacles and more like different expressions of family insecurity. The disguise becomes a metaphor. The movie has not necessarily changed. The viewer has. And that is one reason old comedies can be fascinating to revisit. We discover that our memory preserved a feeling rather than a critical assessment. So where does that leave the final verdict? Big Momma's House 2 is not a technically sophisticated comedy. The critics were justified in pointing out its repetition, predictable structure, uneven jokes, and thin criminal storyline. It is not a film that needs to be defended as a masterpiece. Doing so would miss what makes it interesting. Its real strength lies in personality. Martin Lawrence commits completely to the central performance, and the movie understands that Big Momma is more than a costume. She is the character through which Malcolm is allowed to become more emotionally available. The Fuller family gives him something to care about, and the domestic environment forces him into a kind of vulnerability that his professional life never demands. The comedy may be broad, but the emotional mechanism underneath it is surprisingly clear. If the question is whether this is a great movie, the answer is probably no. If the question is whether it is an effective piece of accessible entertainment, the answer is much easier. It knows its audience. It gives them the character they came to see. It moves quickly. It creates a recognizable mixture of physical comedy and family sentiment. And it offers enough warmth that viewers can forgive the machinery around it. The most important thing about the film, however, may be the contradiction with which we began. Critics looked at Big Momma's House 2 and saw a sequel that repeated itself. Audiences looked at the same movie and saw a familiar experience. Both reactions can be true. A film can be artistically limited and emotionally meaningful. It can be predictable and still comforting. It can be dated and still memorable. It can fail the test of innovation while succeeding at the test of entertainment. Big Momma's House may never win the argument for being great cinema, but it can still win the argument for being memorable cinema in the smaller, more personal sense. People remember it because they remember where they were when they watched it, who they watched it with, how funny Big Momma seemed at the time, and how strangely satisfying it was to see Martin Lawrence turn a ridiculous disguise into an entire personality. The family is ultimately the emotional core, because the story reveals that Malcolm does not become better by becoming someone else. He becomes better by discovering something inside himself that his normal identity kept hidden. The disguise gives him permission to listen. It gives him permission to care. It gives him permission to be embarrassed. And most importantly, it gives him permission to stop treating emotional vulnerability as a weakness. That is why the movie's strangest idea may also be its simplest. Malcolm spends his career pretending to be other people, yet the most ridiculous identity he ever creates ends up revealing something real about him. Big Momma begins as a tool for deception and ends as a vehicle for connection. The costume is fake, the voice is fake, the appearance is fake, but the relationships formed inside that performance are not. Maybe that is why audiences were kinder to this movie than critics were. They were not necessarily rewarding its originality. They were rewarding the feeling it gave them. And feelings have a strange way of surviving flaws. Years after the theatrical numbers and review scores have faded, the image of Martin Lawrence as Big Momma remains instantly recognizable. The movie may be dated. Some jokes may no longer land. Some scenes may feel broader than audiences remember. But the central emotional contradiction still works. Sometimes the role that feels least like you can reveal the person you actually are. So perhaps the fairest verdict is not that Big Mama's House 2 was secretly a masterpiece, because it wasn't. It is that the movie was never as simple as its reputation suggests. It was a flawed, commercially successful, deeply recognizable piece of 2000s comedy that understood the value of familiarity, personality, and emotional warmth. And if you watched it years ago, the most interesting question may not be whether it was ever objectively great. It may be whether the movie you remember is actually the movie that was there all along. If you rewatch it today, do you see an unnecessary sequel, an underrated comfort comedy, or something sitting awkwardly between the two? Maybe the answer depends on how much of your childhood is still sitting underneath the disguise.